you can easily adjust the width of columns and the height of rows whenever needed. You're much more likely to need these with columns rather than using commands, although you can. It's much easier to use the actual column separators. If I want to make column B wider, I'll point the mouse on the boundary between B and C, where the actual letters are, click and drag to make it wider or in some cases narrower. If you make a column too narrow for the numbers to be displayed properly, you will see pound signs. A better solution sometimes is simply to double-click a boundary, and that means in effect, make the column wide enough to handle the widest entry. So we'll double-click. Now, if at a later time, if we happen to put a word here or a long number, maybe I'll put in a long word like this, and press enter. The column width doesn't adjust, but if I double-click the boundary between B and C, it certainly does. I misspelled it anyway, but if I take that out, what happens? The column doesn't get any narrower, so we'll double-click. With numbers, you're less likely to need that. Now, how wide is a column and do we really care? If we put the mouse pointer on a column boundary and hold down the left mouse button, we see its width with some number and then the term pixels. This is 64 pixels wide and so is this one. That's a number hardly worth remembering, but it does at least inform us that the two columns were of the same width. Sometimes, we do keep an eye on that a little bit. Now, recognize if I changed this June entry from $980 to $1,000, that's going to require the use of a comma, and so this will take up more space. What happens when I type $1,000 here? Enter. The column grows automatically. The other columns here, like the one on the left, 64 pixels wide, this one is 75 pixels wide, but we don't worry about that usually. If somehow or the other, you wanted all this to be the same width, you could drag across these columns here, take any of the boundaries, drag it to that width, 75 pixels, something like that. Here we go. Now, they're all exactly the same. If on the other hand, if you said I want each one of these to be wide enough to handle the widest entries, in other words, let's make them all be best fit. Let's drag across all these maybe, even on the column I, double-click a boundary, and every column is wide enough and just wide enough to handle the widest entry. Now, you can certainly get to these features as well by going on the Home tab to the Cells group format, but again this takes us in the territory which usually is no more efficient. It just takes longer to use the feature. It's much easier to adjust these by dragging these boundaries or by double-clicking. You can adjust non-adjacent columns. I could click column B and then with the control key, click column I to adjust both of those widths at the same time. When it comes to row heights, often this is automatic. For example, if I click in cell A1 and I want to use a larger font, in the font group on the Home tab, I'll click the drop arrow, and as I slide over these numbers, you see what's happening to the row height. It's happening automatically. Occasionally, you might want to change row heights. We could easily do that. Let's change the height of these rows here. What do? Drag any of these boundaries. It doesn't make any difference which one. Any boundary between the numbers. Make it a little bit taller maybe. We've made all of those taller at the same time. You're much less likely to want to do that or need to do that, but you certainly can. It's easy to adjust the column widths and row heights. Much more likely with column widths, but it's a feature that works best by using the boundaries of the columns, rather than using the actual commands in the ribbon.